everybody. Welcome to the African Science Fiction Reclaiming Our Voices panel. I'm your host, Joseph Elliott-Coleman, and today I'll be joined by three panelists and science fiction stroke fantasy writers from the African continent. When someone mentions Black science fiction or fantasy, they're often thinking of Anglophone, African American, and British Black writers. However, there has been an explosion of new writers from the African continent who are beginning to reclaim their voices and histories from colonial cultural damage. Our panel discusses the identities and traditions that contribute to the new wave of African science fiction and fantasy. Okay, everybody who's here, could you introduce yourself and tell us who you are, where you're from, and what your work is, what genre do you work in, and what do you do, basically in terms of writing? What have you have published?
Dilman.
Dilman, please start. If you could start us off.
Okay. My name's Dilman Dila. I'm a writer, a filmmaker. I basically work in many genres, so I consider myself a storyteller. But yeah, the two main ones are writing and film. So mostly, of course, I do every kind of genre, from science fiction, fantasy, to more literary kind of stuff. But over the last few years, I've been sticking more to science fiction and fantasy.
Okay, cool. Tobi,
All right.
Is it Tobi?
Tobi, yeah, correct.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, the Ghanaian accent comes out whenever I'm around other Africans, so excuse me. Tell us about yourself.
So my name is Tobi Ogundiran. I'm a Nigerian writer of writes fantasy, horror, science fiction, and all the jazz. Most of my work can be found online, various magazines like Fire Literary Magazine, Beneath the Skies, The Dark, and stuff like that. Yeah, I've been honored, I guess, to be nominated for some awards like the British Science Fiction Association, Shirley Jackson, and the Normals. Yeah.
Cool. And we're just waiting for our final panel attendee. She's just logging in. Yvette, can you hear us? Probably not.
Yeah.
There you go.
Right. Yeah, I'm having a little bit of internet issues.
Okay.
I'm glad
right. I was just starting the panel. I asked everybody to introduce themselves, what they do, what genre they work in, and where they're based. So if you could just tell everyone who you are and give us a short introduction. There you go. Now everybody can see you on Switch. Yeah, if you could just tell us who you are, what you do, what genre you work in, and where you're from.
Yeah, so I'm Yvette Ndlovu. I'm from Zimbabwe, but I'm currently based in Amherst, Massachusetts, where I'm doing my Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. I mostly write Afrofuturism, fantasy. Most recently, I've been kind of experimenting with Afro-Surrealism and kind of having fun with that. I have a short story collection coming out in 2023, and it's a blend of realism, fantasy, and Afro-Surrealism and magical realism. You can find my work forthcoming from the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Fire, and various places. And I'm so glad to be on this panel today.
We're glad you were able to attend. Okay. Now enough of the finer things. Okie dokie. Right. All right. My first question for the three of you would be, what do you think of the term Afrofuturism, and would you use it to define your work? I'll ask Tobi this.
Afrofuturism. I think it's a good term, and it encompasses the ideals, I guess, of the kind of literature which is being penned by, some groups of Black writers who are primarily dealing in either, envisioning a different kind of future for, the Black populace around the globe, or even extrapolating events of the past or of the history, and how trying to come up with a different way, I guess, of how things could have played out in a different context. So yes, it's a good term if that's what you're trying to write into, but it's not something I primarily use to describe my own work. I guess it all depends on where you're coming from, what stories you're trying to tell, what kinds of message you're trying to pass across. And I think we all know now that there's sort of a branching out from just the Afrofuturism. There's the African futurism, the African Jujuism, and things like that. So it's all, like all terms, like all genres, again, because I'm really, really adverse personally to being boxed into different classifications. When we have Afro, then we have Afrofuturism, African Jujuism, things like that. And then it all becomes really, really, really meta. And it's kind of like you're trying to put one in the box, so to speak. So I prefer just general speculative fiction. And yes, there may be elements of so-called Afrofuturism. There could be elements of other kinds of genres, other styles, and yeah, it interests me more.
Okay, Yvette, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about the term Afrofuturism, and what do you use it to describe your work?
Yeah, I would use it to describe some of my work, but I think some of my work might be retro Afrofuturism because I spend like a lot of time thinking about the past and like looking at like what things were like, in pre-colonial Southern Africa, and using those traditions and using that in my work. I actually co-founded an Afrofuturist summer writing workshop.
Oh, so, really?
Yeah, it's called the Voodoo Knot Summer Workshop. So we get together every summer around August, and it's usually a class of 25 Black writers. And what I like about it is that it's, Pan-African. We have, people from diaspora.
That's my favorite word.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that's, I think right now, there's like the debate about, should we call ourselves Afrofuturists or Afro-Jujuists or African futurists? And I think, what the Voodoo Knots, what we try to do is to have a Pan-African, Black speculative space where everybody can come together, no matter if you feel like you're Afro-Jujuism or if you're Afrofuturism.
Actually, that term Juju was brought to my attention by a friend of mine, a guy by the name of Tade Thompson. Are you aware of him?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, he brought to my attention that the word actually derives from a French word that means toy. It is a word used to describe African religions. So when I hear that word, I kind of had, sorry about the divergence, but I kind of find myself thinking, okay, this is a word that has been co-opted, but it was a negative word. I kind of feel ever so slightly ambivalence about it, because it's I don't know whether people who use the word are aware of its connotations, its original connotations. So I was not aware of Afro-Judaism. What would that be what would that be an umbrella term for? What does that describe? Is that would that be African fantasy or?
I think
something close. Oh, okay, yeah, Dilman, go ahead.
So I haven't even asked you the question. Sorry.
It's fine. No, when you mention like the origins of the word, I always like feel strongly. It's the first time I'm hearing about the origins of the Juju word. But with me, generally, most words that are describe either African religious systems or belief systems, and they're in English or in French, are normally not. I will try to avoid using them as much as possible. Like something like witchcraft or witch doctor, specifically witch doctor, which is what is used to describe a whole host of, certain kind of healers and scientists who practice in Africa. but they are not witches, they are not doctors, they are their own thing. And so it needed like another word, you know, because witch doctor kind of, it kind of primitivizes what the science and all that behind their knowledge system. So yeah, I try to avoid, if I know that a word has English or French origin, then, and it's describing something to do with African belief systems, I will probably not use it.
Okay.
You know, that's
Oh,
interesting that you mentioned, because I also wasn't aware of like the origins of the word juju. But in Nigeria, for example, the Yoruba tribe, because I'm Yoruba, the word juju has been part of the Yoruba lexicon, I should say, for centuries now, which actually means, our own cosmology and the mysticism. So I guess, and the Afro-Judaism was coined by Nnedi Okorafor. She's also Nigerian. So I guess when she's coining that, it's sort of representing, her own interpretation of, Nigerian or African mysticism, not necessarily fantasy, but because it's real, it's real. So yeah, that's what.
Let me just jump on that point that you've made, Tobi. Would you, in fact, let me throw this out there to everybody. Would you consider Afro-Judaism to be a completely different thing to the kind of fantasy that people such as Rowling and Tolkien and George R. R. Martin and all those guys kind of write? Even going further back, I mean, things such as the Nibelung and things such as Beowulf, would you consider it a completely different thing that isn't comparable to the European ideal of what mysticism and fantasy is? For anyone who wants to answer, I mean, would you consider it a completely different animal? Maybe. Or is it a similar thing? There are similarities.
Okay, maybe let me go first, and okay, I'll try to link it with the definitions, because it goes back to the same thing about whether you're calling your work Afrofuturism or this or that or the other. I know, like, at some point labels are kind of necessary to market a work, because like when you go to a bookshop, you'll want to look for certain kinds of works. So if everything, you go to a bookshop and they just say, oh, that's the horror section. And in the horror section, you have Stephen King and you have all those big names. And then there is Dilman's book somewhere, it gets lost sort of. And then you might want the bookshop to say, oh, there is horror. And then within horror, there is, if you're looking for African stuff, it's, tucked somewhere there. And then, so your work kind of finds a place, if I can use that. But it wouldn't be different from what Stephen King has written, because at the end of the day, it is the same thing. Stephen King will write about the clown in Maine. I'll write about a puppeteer in Tororo. And when you read the stories, they are kind of, at the back of it all, it's the same thing, like it's the same horror kind of story, because we are humans and we write about human experiences, and our experiences might be defined by our cultures, where we grow up, where we live, and stuff like that. So we might want to write a story that is specific to Uganda and say, oh yeah, this is Ugandan horror, it's not American horror. But when you strip it of all that, it all comes down to being just horror. For me, what I think of these labels, they are really a capitalist kind of thing, because if you look back in the day before capitalism, all stories were just stories.
Yes.
You wouldn't say we are telling a horror story, we are telling a science fiction story. You'll just say, oh, story time, yeah, story time. And everybody gathers around the fire. They sing, they dance, they tell their stories, and then everybody goes back home happy. Then the capitalism comes in, and then with capitalism comes elitism also. And then there are people who say, oh, this is literature, this is not literature. Even if you look at things that Shakespeare wrote, and they say, you know, Shakespeare is the highest form of literature, I mean, according to the English, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
But Shakespeare wrote horrors. Macbeth is basically a horror.
Yes.
He wrote, yeah, Tolstoy wrote a romance with War and Peace. It's basically a romance. But somehow, today, if you write a horror, they will say, oops, it's a horror. It's not literature. And you can't go to the Booker Prize. But
no,
you know, this all came about because of, you know, capitalism and all that. And we find ourselves in this system. So at some point, we kind of, you know, just go along with it, especially for the readers. You tell readers, oh, yeah, this is African futurism. It is science fiction, but it is African futurism. And people are dying to read new kinds of works. They don't want to read only the white men kind of things. So they'll say, oh, yeah, I read African futurism, and I go with it. But at the end of the day, it's all just stories.
Yes, yes. I'm actually a bookseller. I work at a bookshop, and I've noticed a trend in that customers who come in from the ages of 20 upwards are very, very interested in reading material from different cultures. They want to know more about the world. I mean, these are people who grew up seeing, you know, Michelle Yeoh and Samuel Jackson on TV. So they realize the world is a very, very, very big place, and they want to know more. You know, the amount of people who I've seen walking out of my bookstore buying Marlon James, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, or Chinua Achebe, and these are people who have never come into a bookstore, and they're walking out with copies of, you know, what's the guy's name again? What's the guy's book again? Not The Arrow of God. What's this? This is his first.
You're probably talking of Amos Tutola?
No. I'm talking about Chinua Achebe's first. The book he's most say again. Things Fall Apart. Yes. You know, people who have walked in here would probably first time they've been to a bookstore and they're like, yeah, do you have a Chinua Achebe? No, it's Chinua Achebe. Yeah. Can I buy a copy of Things Fall Apart? You're like, wait, what? It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. It really gives me hope. You know, it tells me there is hope. Yvette, let me ask you a question. Do you find labels restrictive? You know, I'm asking this question off the back of Dilman's response, which is quite brilliant.
Yeah, so I actually want to go back to the point you brought up about the origins of the word Jujuism.
Cool.
So when we're coming up with a name for the Black Afrofuturist workshop, we settled on voodoo knots. But, you know, the word voodoo was used, you know, by, you know, British settlers to kind of put all African belief systems into that one label. So why we use voodoo is to reclaim that, you know, reclaim it as science, reclaim it as, you know, our belief system. And then we added knots to the end because it's an Afrofuturist workshop, and we were looking forward to the future, that we can bring our past and our belief systems, you know, into the future, and you know, they're valid and they're legit. So I think with the word, you know, juju or voodoo, that we can reclaim these words and we can reclaim labels and use them for ourselves, and, you know, use them to do what we want to do, you know, despite the restrictions that may be there.
Very true. The reclamation of one's own language. I find it's a very powerful trend that I've read in a lot of not just Afrofuturism, but just, I don't want to use the word literature. I'm going to use the word stories from now on. There you go, Dilman. You've had a positive effect already. In stories written by, and I'm going to use the catch-all term, by Africans, people from people of African descent. You know, very, very. Almost, I want to say the word desperate. I would say there's a fierce need to take back things that have been stolen from us. I think. Okay, moving on. Okay. Do you think that how much do your experiences and the history of the countries you live in color your work and form a backdrop for your stories? I'm going to ask Tobi this.
Okay. I mean, to a very, very large extent, because I lived in Nigeria up until I was 19 years old. Then I went to Russia for 7 years for studies. So, my upbringing and everything I basically knew up until that point was Nigerian culture, Nigerian history. And yeah, it really, really influences the way I think, the way I approach writing and things like that. And even up to literature, because we had thanks to the first set of, I would say, Nigerian writers, the Chinua Achebes, Wole Soyinka, we had a very anti-colonialist approach to literature in that they immediately started to write books for children because they were like, there was no literature for children. All they had was, English books, learning about snow and pudding and things which did not necessarily apply to, the average Nigerian kid. So we all grew up reading, seeing ourselves represented, in literature. So there was no, I guess, loss of identity or problem with representation. And again, there were no hard lines drawn between genres because these Nigerian writers we had, they wrote across the board, what you call today speculative fiction, everything was there. So when I started reading Western fiction and I started seeing, what the lacks, I would say, of representation, the different approach these writers take to writing, the different imagination, basically, obviously I loved this. I absolutely adored, reading about dragons and knights and everything. Like it was wonderful. So, but I already had a basis, a solid foundation, I should say. So when I started writing, it became sort of an amalgamation of things I loved from the Western point of view, things I loved from my own culture, and how I can interpret it into my own fiction, the kind of stories I'm trying to tell, the messages I'm also trying to pass across. Yeah.
Good. Yvette, same answer for you. Same question for you, rather.
Yeah. So like, Tobi mentioned, my first stories, had nothing to do with where I was from. I thought, a Zimbabwean girl couldn't be in a story. So I'd set my stories in like islands far away, and I'd make up, these islands, and usually those islands were close to America, and things like that. But then reading Hufia's death and the Binti trilogy, that really helped me. I was like, wow.
Good Lord, love that. Yeah.
I was like, wow, here's a Black girl, an African girl doing things in space, and that was liberating.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that was the first book that I read that was so African. I was just like, that's how you do it. Yeah, I was clapping as I was reading. I was like, yes, more like that, please. But sorry to interrupt you. Please continue.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that I love about Binti is that it's based off of a Namibian tribe, and they're actually one of the fewest tribes that wasn't affected by colonialism because they live deep in the desert, so the white settlers couldn't, get there. So their culture is pretty much intact. So I love that, Neri did that research and, she got it right. And yeah, it was just really beautiful to see. But in terms of my own work, I'm currently working on a novel, and it's based off of an empire in Zimbabwe, the Mutapa Empire. And they created the Great Zimbabwe, which are the largest ruins, the second largest ruins in Africa, like second to the pyramids. And one thing that, is fascinating is that a lot of people know about the pyramids, but nobody knows, about the Great Zimbabwe. And it's a great architectural marvel. And, like nobody really knows about it except like Southern Africans and a few, other people who may have been like exposed to African history. And so, my work is, to, bring the Great Zimbabwe, into, the public eye and kind of have the Great Zimbabwe have the same status as the pyramids. So that's, what I'm doing right now is, with my novel is it's based on the Mutapa Empire and it's set on the Great Zimbabwe.
Okay. Excellent. I look forward to it. Maybe you can send me a draft. I would love to read it. Yeah, same for all of you. Please send me your wares. I want to read them. Dilman, what do you think?
I don't know. I think with me also, like, yeah, a lot of my history and where I come from influenced my work. Like, my work is actually mostly autobiographical, and
Okay.
it's stories that I had as a child that just keep coming back into making their way. I don't think I struggled with having to write white people kind of stories, or like putting white people in them. I didn't even have that issue of, reading a book and then thinking like I wanted to see a black person in it or something like that. I don't know, but I don't remember having those feelings. Though, of course, the first time I read Octavia Butler's book and there was a black character in it, I was surprised. And I looked at the back to read the biography of the author, and it just said Octavia Butler. There was no picture. I was like, who is this? I even thought it was a man. Yeah, I thought it was a man. And then later, many years later, that's when I realized that, oh, Octavia Butler was actually a black woman. But that was the one time that it made me, kind of, it just jumped out to me. But of course, I would read these books, and then I would just have my local versions of these stories. I remember, I think I started writing when I was about 15 years. And yeah, when I look back, the stories were heavily inspired by Stephen King and Robert Ludlum, especially Jason Bourne. I remember my character was somehow modeled after Jason Bourne, but he was not a white person.
We all wear our influences on our sleeve when we first write our first novels. I mean, my first novel, it had the arm of Warren Ellis, the head of Frank Herbert, the spine of Hideo Kojima, the legs of Stephen King, the soul of E.E. Smith. It was just like, yeah, you got this from you got this from it. No, I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that that was the kind of situation that I remember, like in my early years. But for me, stories were always to be adapted. Like, I knew there was a system, and it was a white system. And in all films, we'll see the American versus Vietnam films, and we know that it's a white guy and is going to win. And we will go to the cinemas, we call them video halls here, and we'll watch those films. But when we come out, we will tell those same stories, but we'll tell them, with local flair. And so, growing up in Tororo in the 80s and 90s, we didn't have TV, we didn't have, it wasn't a big city. So most of the time, somebody will watch a film, and then he tells other people about this film. And when he's telling the films, he's not going to say it like he watched a film. He will tell a story. And then it's later on when you watch a film, you say, oh, this guy was talking about this film. So that kind of conditioned me to think of stories as something to be adapted, if I put it in that way. By the time I started writing, I was already in that mode. And I just knew there was a system, there was a white system, there were white protagonists and all that. But then there were our stories that we tell, and we can, we can retell those same stories, but we in the local version. Some of these led to the emergence of what we call video jockeys, like VJs. What they do, they will sit beside the TV with the microphone. They're basically translators. And then they begin narrating what the audience is seeing. This is because the audience doesn't understand English. And the one person who understands English will begin telling the audience what is happening on the screen. But what they will do, it's Schwarzenegger beating up bad guys, but he gives Schwarzenegger a local name, he gives Schwarzenegger a local history, a local background, and then people feel more connected to the story. And though they are watching a white person, in their mind, they're really seeing a black person doing that. So yeah, on the whole, that is kind of how I think I approach writing up to now. But most of the stories that I had as a child still inform me or inform all my stories. Like the recent one of my recent novellas, it's called Abiba. And it's based really on a myth that I kept hearing throughout my childhood about people who fly with fire burning in their asses. And I'm like, what are these people? You know, like you try to ask around and say, can you tell me more about Abiban? No, yeah, they just fly at night and they have fire in their harnesses. And that's all they tell you about it. I don't know where the myth came from. I don't know, you know, what started it or what, but somehow that kind of thing has stuck in me. And every time I see a dragon, I'm not thinking of the, you know, the European dragon, you know, the big lizard. I'm thinking of Anna Biba, and I'm thinking of fire in, you know, the bat hole coming out, and I'm like, I should tell that story. I should do a dragon story like that. So the novel I wrote, it's a fledgling Abiba, very much based on that. But 90% of my works, like if you find a creature in it, if you find somebody with magical powers in it, it's probably based on something I had as a child or in the streets of Tororo, or something that is pretty much told in the streets. Yeah.
Do you find that, a question just occurred to me, do you find that, or have you found that there is a difficulty in not, because European and Asian history is so ubiquitous and so easy to access? Somebody's probably going to call me on that. Do you find that there's a difficulty in finding out in researching African, I mean, I don't want to, I'm going to use the catch-all term, as in the African continent, African myths and mythology? I mean, is it readily accessible, or is there do you feel that there's a difficulty in actually uncovering where these myths and legends come from due to colonialized due to the white man basically come in and yeah. Sorry, I haven't had my coffee yet. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, you know, it is hard, you know, doing research. Like, you know, for me, you know, I'm lucky to have, you know, my grandparents, so I can, you know, always ask them, you know, to fill in the gaps. But because a lot of knowledge wasn't written down, you know, you hear varying accounts. My grandmother might describe like a tikoloshi, which is this dwarf spirit in Southern Africa. She might describe it, you know, differently from somebody else. So there's just like varying accounts of different things. But I think that's where our job comes in as writers, to fill in those gaps, and, you know, to create new things from, you know, the little that, you know, we still do know and the little knowledge that we still have access to.
Tobi, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just like Yvette, I find myself asking my grandparents and my parents for stories about, you know, certain things in mythology, which really interests me. But again, I just, I take creative liberties with those things which I'm not really clear on and which I find difficult to access, you know, materials or written history on it. Again, because most of African history is not written; it's largely oral, you know, passed from generations to generations. It's difficult to find written text, and the texts which are available are largely written by, you know, foreigners, you know, white people writing about Africa, and you can't be 100% sure that it's, you know, it's accurate or it does justice to the actual mythology. So I like to go to the horse's mouth to ask my grandparents who are still alive. Yeah.
Dilman, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with all of them, like, you know, because somebody else wrote our history, and this person did not have a good agenda. This person wanted people to believe we are primitive and backward. And so what they wrote about us, what has been preserved about us, is not the picture of what it was back then. However, there is a lot of stuff in old books. And when I'm reading old books, I normally look at the footnotes, and I normally read between the lines, because that's where the truth is. Like, there is this book. I was in a panel on the history thing just a couple hours ago, and we're talking about the same thing really. But what I discovered was just like when you look at a book written in 1800s, 1900s about Africa, what is on top is going to be the white man's view, but what he puts in the footnotes will probably be what is on the ground. Like the example I give is the one of gay people in Africa.
Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of, like today in Africa, we are made to believe we didn't have gay people in our cultures.
Okay. Yes.
And yet I'm reading this anthropological book about a people called the Langi. It was written, I think, in 1923. And this guy, he puts a footnote in the book. I think it's 100 and something pages, but it's just like 2 paragraphs. I think he was commenting on something about marriage. And then he says, oh, there are actually men who marry men. And it's a common practice. And the men they marry are given all the privileges of a wife. That's all he says about it. Yeah. And he says it's a common practice in Lango, in the Ateker communities, and that's like a huge chunk of northeastern Uganda, like about 4 or 5 million people around that time. So when you look at this, you know that is the truth. Yeah, but what has been passed down and what has been put into Africans' minds now is that we didn't have gay people in our communities. And now, like, if you look at all the presidents, all they say, our culture doesn't tolerate gay people. It's against our culture to bring gay people into it and all this. So yeah, that's where you'll find the truth. And of course, as Tobi says, you look at oral stuff. You go to the old people. I'm fortunate I grew up in a small town rather than a city. And in this small town, we had, it was more cosmopolitan than the capital city because the town grew because of a railway station that was splitting to go to different parts of the country. And so it attracted a lot of traders and a lot of people. So at the time I was growing up, there was no local ethnic group that claimed this town. And the main language spoken was Kiswahili. So I had a lot of stories from a lot of different cultures, from Somalis, from Arabs, from Indians, I had all these stories, and somehow they stuck with me. And those are normally what I look at when I'm thinking about the truths about our histories. And of course, every time I go up country, every time I go to the village, I talk to the people there. It doesn't matter if they are old or young. I just ask them, we jazz on stories, at street level stuff. And, you tell them, are there ghosts here? And you hear the interesting stories they tell you about, oh, yeah, we have, people who walk up at night and then, they have been charmed and yeah, stuff like that. So I don't look at the textbooks and the official version of things. Though, of course, in Uganda, the official version can actually be what Tobi said before, that people will live with juju in our everyday lives. And you find in Uganda, you have headlines like a witch doctor, for lack of a better word, I don't like calling them witch doctors. I normally use the local equivalent word for them. But yeah, this person is suing the Speaker of Parliament because he provided the Speaker with magic that helped her succeed in her politics, but she has not paid back. And so he was taking the Speaker of Parliament to prison. 2-3 years later, after this happened, the Speaker lost her position in Parliament, and people are like, oh, it's because you did pay that guy. So you have these stories, and you have to listen to these kind of stories to mind them for what you can use in your time, and just to look at the truth. What might have it been like back in the past? Because if this is happening now, I imagine 100 years ago, if a king wanted to stay in power, he probably had his magic person somewhere who he will consult and who will be, his power, his source of power, something like that. We used to hear those stories also, like a powerful person has a tree, you cut down that tree, or like a president has a tree, you cut it down, the president is overthrown in a coup or something like that. So you listen to these small stories, which are not exactly, which our education system encourages us to disregard as primitive and backward. And that is where I get the truths about our history and about ourselves.
Thank you for that full and complete answer. It's, yeah. Let me ask you all a question. Some time ago, I had a conversation with another writer, a writer by the name of Jeanette Ig. She wrote a novel by the name of Under the Pendulum Sun. I don't know whether you're aware of it, but it's quite a brilliant novel. Everybody should read it. She voiced I wouldn't really call it a frustration, but the idea that we, as she's East Asian, she voiced the idea, the frustration that we as writers, as ethnic writers, we have a responsibility to represent our culture at all times in our writing, or should we just tell the stories that we want to tell? Now, from my perspective, growing up in the United Kingdom, I grew up in an extremely cosmopolitan environment. My friends are from, I have friends from all walks of life, or ethnicities, or faiths, or gender identities and orientations. So that is very much reflected in my work, especially in the novel that I'm currently trying to get published. But I say all that to say this. Do you think, going back to the point Yvette made about, reclaiming our identity and, putting these oral histories down, actually nailing them onto paper, do you think that we have a responsibility, all of us, to tell our, oh God, I'm going to just say it the way it's in my head, to tell our great African quote unquote science fiction or fantasy novel, or should we just follow our curiosities and tell the stories that we want to tell? Yvette, I'll ask you that. Put the question to you.
Yeah, I think, tell the stories you want to tell, because I think, sometimes you get boxed into representing everybody, and you can't possibly represent everybody because, I'm from a different tribe from, a lot of people in Zimbabwe. So they definitely will not, relate to that because we have, these differences. And I think a lot of Black writers and writers of color have the burden of representation. Yes. I remember when Tomi Adeyemi's book, Children of Blood and Bone, came out, she actually had a lot of Nigerian people who didn't like the book because they said, oh, she took a town that's like, I don't know, in maybe northern Nigeria, and then, she's claiming it's in, I don't know, southern Nigeria.
Really?
I don't remember what it was. Yeah, and they're like, no, this is not authentic. This is not representing, Nigerians, because she took, the name of a town that was in a different region and, put it in another region in her fantasy map. So I think, it's things like that where, when you're a Black writer, people want you to represent things, the way they are. Yeah. But, you can't possibly do that. So write the stories, you want to write. That's always my thinking.
Okay. Tobi, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really against, I feel the job of a writer is to tell stories. The job of a writer is not to be an ambassador, for your culture or whatever. Now, it is understandable as, African writers, because we have been, or let's say there's been a dearth of our literature on the world stage, particularly if we're talking about speculative fiction. So there's sort of little known about it. So it's understandable that it's expected, for you to sort of show us a culture, show us what you have and things like that. But I don't feel that should be the number one priority. I personally don't take it as my, my aim when I'm writing. I just want to write good stories, stories which which the readers are going to enjoy. Now, as I'm writing, based on my own experiences, my own points of view, I guess, on the world and everything that I've experienced, I could infuse that into my writing. And anyone who reads it, any foreigner who's then interested, he reads something about my culture and is furthermore interested, wants to learn more, can go online, go on Google, and please knock yourself out to learn about the culture. But I don't feel it should be, the job of the writer to be, because it's too much of a burden. Such burdens in place of on other writers of, on white or Western writers, so to speak. So it's not something most ethnic writers should. It's not fair, I guess, that it should be expected of ethnic writers to be preachers, and ambassadors of their culture and stuff like that. For me, I just want to write a good story. I've come here for a good time, and if you're interested in learning more, then if I've written, the story in such a way that I've piqued your interest in learning more about the continent, then my job is done.
Cool.
Yeah.
Dilman, what do you think?
I think I probably take the side of, I'll just add on what you guys have said, but twist it up a bit, because, we've been reading about ourselves from a certain perspective, but this perspective has always not been the right perspective.
Okay.
And they are always distorting our reality. So when people are asking African writers to be authentic, it's not because they want them to be ambassadors, but they are expecting them to tell stories that they can easily relate to. I'm one of those who didn't like Children of Blood and Bone, and it was basically for some of those reasons. Like, an African person will not go about describing themselves by skin color. And I was like, yeah, it just put me off. After a while, I was like, this doesn't feel like it's set in Lagos, so it's set in Nigeria. So yeah, there are those things which you look at and you're like, if it is a white person writing, you would have banned them. So why are you expecting the the Nigerian writer to distort the geography of Nigeria by making a northern town a southern town, and or like you make them do like what they did in Wakanda. They put cultures which are as far apart as East and West Africa, and they put it all in one country. And I'm like, that's like ridiculous. You can't do that. If you're writing Wakanda, which is in East Africa, don't bring in West African stuff and South African stuff, because those are totally worlds apart. So there is that thing that the readers are pushing against, and they're like, Africa is not a country. And if we as the writers are saying, oh, but I don't have to subscribe to that, I write my story the way I write it, then you still fall in the same group of the white guys who are just saying, oh, I'll write about Africa, and I'll get a culture from the Kosa, and I'll get one from the Yoruba and the Maasai, and put them all together, and yeah, you have an abstract thing. So yeah, you have a certain responsibility to at least be authentic.
Cool. How much long? I fear we have 2 minutes left. Okay, let me very, very quickly go to some of the questions. Question from that came in from someone who's a bookseller. As a bookseller, I would say that people need to ask for going back to the first thing about people, the point I made about people coming in and reading more diverse material. As a bookseller, I would say that people need to ask for these things if they can't find them, especially if they have someone's name. We get asked for it. The more we get asked for it, the more we learn about other authors ourselves. And very, very quickly, before we get cut off, before they turn off the lights, what's it called? Which science fiction novel would you like to see given a Hollywood treatment? Very quickly, boom. Yvette, which science fiction novel would you like to see given a Hollywood treatment?
Oh wow, putting me on the spot. I think I recently read The Gilded Ones by Nami Nafona, who's a Sierra Leonean writer. I think that would be epic to see that on screen.
Tobi, which one for you?
I'd like to see the Wormwood trilogy by Tali Thompson. I think it's a very unusual alien invasion, and how that's going to play on TV. I'm really interested in how that's going to be.
Me too. Dilman, which science fiction or fantasy novel would you like to see given a Hollywood treatment?
Actually, quite a lot of them, but maybe 30 Went West, if I have one off my head. It was written by Nikhil Singh. I think he's South African writer.
Yeah, in South Africa.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's 30 Went West. It's just a crazy book.
Cool.
Tobi, I see you enjoying NEPA.
Just let me think. Yeah, I think we've have we come to the end? Are we?
I think we're at the end.
Oh, I think we're at the end, I'm afraid. Yep, we're done. All right. Thank you all of you for taking time out of your schedules to come and involve yourself in this talk. It was absolutely fantastic. I really hope we have the opportunity to do it again. I've learned a lot, and the responses to the questions have taught me more than I thought I would know. Yeah. Thanks to you all, and thanks to October for providing this opportunity. Yeah. And I think that's it. I think we're done.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you.